The overarching message of this report is that migration can be good for human development. It can bring large gains to people's incomes, to their education, to their general empowerment in many respects. Secondly, however, there are very important barriers to movement, and those barriers both reduce the possible benefits and also mean that people are unfairly treated and subject to risks and costs that are unnecessary. Thirdly, and relatedly, there's a role for much better policies to improve the outcomes from migration for human development.
What are the main myths that we're busting here?
An initial key myth is that of the myth of invasion, that hordes of people are moving from poor developing countries to rich countries. There's much more movement than in the past to developed countries, but less than 4 in 10 international migrants are moving from developing to developed countries, and, for example, fewer than 1% of all Africans move to Europe. So that's one important myth. The second important myth is that internal migration is not important. In fact, we find that there are 4 times as many internal migrants, people moving within the borders of their own country, in the world relative to international migrants. And finally, and I think also importantly, the share of international migrants in the world overall has not increased at all in the last 50 years. As a share of the population, the number is the same, about 3%. Of course, the number has grown as the world population has grown. The abuses and vulnerabilities faced by migrants is a very important and very real issue. I think that measures can be taken on several sides. Firstly, on the side of governments in origin places, making sure that people are aware of their rights before they leave. There are important responsibilities on the part of the governments in the places that migrants go to ensure against abuse. Certainly employers have a very important role to play, unions have an important role to play, as well as civil society. I mean, certainly the role of government to take care of people who come as refugees and asylum seekers and so on. They have obligations under international law. With respect to people who are economically motivated to move, they have obligations towards migrants like they have obligations to any other citizens within their society. So there are obligations to, for example, ensure against discrimination. There's obligations to allow access to services and so on. So it's very important that governments enable migrants equity of access and equity of treatment relative to non-migrants or citizens within their countries. What the actual entitlements are going to be is going to vary on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, in the US, people cannot access unemployment benefits indefinitely. So one would not expect migrants to access benefits indefinitely. What we find in the report is that there's disparity in treatment. So governments treat migrants differently to the way they treat citizens with respect to access to employment, protection of employment, access to health and education and so on. And what we recommend very strongly is equity of treatment of migrants. A key initial difficulty is that of language. Although what we do find in the report is that about half of migrants move to places in the neighbourhood and to places with similar languages. But for those who move further afield, clearly language is an important barrier and constrain access to jobs. Another key barrier in many places is access to basic services. Being able to send kids to school, being able to have children immunised, for example, is another key challenge. What we've also found in the context of the recession is that migrants are much more likely to be laid off. So migrants are losing their jobs disproportionately relative to locals, and that's clearly creating hardship as well. Migration is expensive, and what we find is that it's actually more expensive for poor people than it is for better off people. And so people can spend up to half a year's salary simply on the fees to enable them to move. And even prior to that, one needs a birth certificate. We know that 50 million kids around the world don't even have a birth certificate, so it's difficult for them to get a passport. To get a passport in, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo costs almost as much as annual income. So those sorts of paper walls are very important barriers to moving. I think there are kind of two main kind of dimensions of action which are very important at this point. Firstly is to liberalise and to simplify access, conditional on the availability of jobs, to allow people to come when jobs are available to seek work and realise opportunities. Secondly, to ensure equity of treatment, access to basic services on the same basis as citizens. Well, irregular status brings enormous costs for many migrants. In many countries, they're denied access to services. As a result, they're vulnerable to exploitation by employers because they're fearful of deportation. It also creates costs for the community at large because there are numbers of people there who are not present lawfully, and that can undermine the sense of the rule of law. So regularisation is very important. It can happen in different ways. One is to expand access to entry, so people actually come on a legal basis, and that is clearly preferable to people moving illegally. A second way is through so-called regularisation or amnesties, whereby people can earn, if you like, the right to be able to stay in a country based on, for example, their job record, their lack of criminal conviction, and over time be integrated fully into the society. The ideal scenario would be dealing with the constraints to access in a constructive way, and that would involve looking forward, opening up and allowing people to come to seek jobs or obtain jobs in the economy or in the society. At the same time, addressing the challenge of people who are already in the country without regular status, who are denied access to important protections and benefits and are vulnerable in different ways, by undertaking something like amnesties, which have been done in many countries quite successfully in the past, and for those who are there and unable to take advantage of the amnesty, enforcing kind of the immigration laws and regulations in ways which are humane and in accordance with international law. What I hope from this report is that, based on a better sense of the underlying facts and the dimensions of the nature of mobility and the potential gains that it can bring for development and human development, that policymakers will be encouraged to move forward on what is really quite a tough agenda. And it would do so on two broad fronts. One would be to liberalise access and simplify access, so that low-skilled people in particular can move. And secondly, it would ensure equity of treatment for those who do move. The relations between migration and human development happen at different levels. For the migrants themselves, most importantly, there are important gains in terms of their prospects for education, health, income, not only for themselves but also for their families. The links to development and human development also happen in the origin places through the flows of money, ideas, different networks which flow back home and can bring benefits there as well. And then finally, but certainly not least, there are important benefits as well for the destination places through the diversity and the ideas again which migrants bring.